Thanks for tuning in. I'm Craig Lieberman, and I've been tinkering on cars since 1980. I've owned more than 40 cars in my life. Some were heroes, some were zeros. But never in my wildest dreams would I ever guess that 3 of my cars would go on to star in a motion picture franchise. My Supra, my GTR, and my Maxima all had starring roles in Universal's Fast and Furious movies. Over the next 3 years, I'd served Universal as a technical advisor. I helped choose the cars, procure the parts, oversee their builds, and support both production and post-production. I've got some great stories to tell, and that's why I created this channel. I hope you like the video. What's up, everybody? Craig Lieberman back at you with another episode. It's probably safe to say that everyone realizes that the first Fast and Furious movie wasn't a documentary. It was anything but. It was actually classified as a crime drama. Nevertheless, for gearheads, this movie has become the de facto representation of the car modifying world. As such, many of us seem to hold it to an impossible standard of accuracy. Newsflash, this movie was not meant to appeal to gearheads. It was made to attract audiences who like action movies. Regardless, director Rob Cohen decided that he wanted to ensure at least a reasonable amount of technical accuracy. For this, he hired both R.J. De Vera and me as technical advisors. I would consult on the car stuff, R.J. would consult mostly on the culture of the tuner world. My specific role as technical advisor was to lend an element of technical accuracy by overseeing the builds of the cars. The key word in the technical advisor title is advisor. I gave advice. They didn't always take it. So for this video, I'm going to talk about the technical inaccuracies in the movie and the stories behind them. I'm largely going to ignore most of the continuity errors because A, there's too many of them, and B, continuity was not my job. Let's jump in. In the opening scene, Dom and the crew are in the middle of a truck hijacking operation. If you pay attention to the lead Honda Civic, you'll see that the rear wing is first a double-decker wing, and then it switches to a single wing, and it goes back and forth. So what happened to the second airfoil in the wing? It was removed so the stuntman didn't get tangled up in it during the scene. So we used 2 cars, the shiny one and the stunt car. But the real technical error is that a Honda Civic cannot drive under a semi-truck without getting crushed. The Civic is too tall to fit under a semi-trailer as configured in the United States. So how did we do it? The trailer was custom made to be 18 inches higher off the ground. You can actually see the main modification in this shot. The next scene is Brian's test run at Dodger Stadium. First off, if you've ever seen Dodger Stadium from the air, you'll know that the property is a big giant circle. While the real Hero 1 Eclipse was an RS model, it was only making about 140 horsepower at most. So there's no way that car could have hit 140 miles an hour in that short parking lot. Even if we pretended the movie Eclipse was an actual turbocharged GST or GSX Eclipse, there just isn't enough room to do it. Of course, the hyperactive shifting always raises a few eyebrows, largely because that model of Eclipse was a 5-speed, and he shifted 5 times, making it a 6-speed, which didn't exist in that car. But here we are, people still talking about that to this day. The next scene is Brian arriving at Racer's Edge, where he promptly goes in the shop and screams to Harry, I need NOS, I need NOS. Number one, it's not called NOS. In fact, 2 weeks ago, I called the founder and owner of Nitrous Oxide, Mike Thermos, and we had a good laugh about that. He said, we never called it NOS before the movie, never. This was to be one of the many technical errors in the dialogue. I was asked to create a list of some automotive terminology that could be used in the movie in case I wasn't on set when they were filming a certain scene. So I did so. I went out and created a list of generic car terms along with some application-specific terms. The script writers reviewed my list and created their own list from my list, which I then revised further and sent it back to them. This is the actual list I sent them back in May of 2000, complete with my handwritten notes. Now, of course, anybody who knows anything about cars would know that many of these terms are application-specific, as I was just saying. But again, since I wasn't on set every day, largely because I had a full-time job running the Naira Drag series for Super Street magazine, I couldn't be there to correct any errors by the actors. So there were sometimes I wasn't on set when they were filming. The fact that Brian thought nitrous oxide would help his top speed is another stretch of the truth. Gear ratios, final drive ratio, aerodynamics, horsepower, and other factors determine a car's top speed, not how much nitrous you're running. Nitrous will get you there faster, but it's not going to increase your top speed. You can learn more about what determines the top speed of a car by watching videos like this one from Engineering Explained. He has a great YouTube channel, you should check it out. The next scene is Brian having lunch at Dom's Market. Dom's crew pulls up with the several cars, including my Nissan Maxima, and they start having a conversation about the Maxima. They pop the hood. Page 21 of the script has that dialogue.
It's your fuel map. It's got a nasty hole. That's why you're unloading in third.
I told you we started.
That lengthen the injected pulse. Another millisecond, just tune the NOS timer, you're 1/9.
Essentially, Jesse was supposed to be looking at the laptop, and the scripted dialogue went like this. Check it out, dude. It's got a nasty hole and a weird peak. We lengthen the injector pulse a few more milliseconds, adjust the nitrous timer, and you're going to bust a 10, meaning a 10-second quarter mile. Not a maximum, not ever. There's lots of problems with that dialogue, not the least of which is the fact that a street car wouldn't be using a nitrous timer at that power level, and certainly for street driving. So I rewrote it as shown here. This FEMU is garbage, man. You need to get bigger injectors and a bigger fuel pump so we can turn up the boost. An FMU is just a Band-Aid, dude. We need to do it right. An FMU is a fuel management unit which builds fuel pressure relative to boost. And for my Maxima, that would have been 100% legit and accurate. But they didn't do that. A little while later, Brian pulls up to a gathering of street racers in this now famous scene. After some back and forth and some dialogue, Jesse pops the hood on Brian's Eclipse. Here's where it gets interesting. What Jesse utters next is a combination of basic modifications that are irrelevant and some bombastic bullshit.
See a cool air intake, it's got a nice fogger system and a T4 turbo Dominic. You see an AIC controller, it has direct port nitrous injection.
Yeah, and a standalone fuel management system.
I see cool air intake, big deal, that's like 5 horsepower, and a nitrous fogger system, remember that. A T4 turbo, an AIC controller, which is an additional injector controller. Then he says direct port nitrous injection. What? You don't have 2 nitrous systems on a wheezy, naturally aspirated, stock block 428 Eclipse. And of course, Dom chimes in with, and a standalone fuel management system, which would be at the very least unnecessary for a car with those modifications. The original dialogue was even worse. 1.8 bar boost, twin turbo, 850cc injectors, Greddy exhaust, HKS intercooler, racing wastegate, Type R blow-off valve, HKS cams ported and polished, like you could see cams by looking at the valve cover. I didn't like what was in the script, so I passed several notes with suggestions for corrected dialogue. I felt that something like this worked better. It's a 4G custom intake manifold, T51 turbo, Haltech ECU, probably making around 400 ponies, assuming beefed up internals, plus maybe another 100 for the nitrous fogger system if you got greedy. That might have worked. Of course, the Eclipse did not have a 4G engine, so that wouldn't have been accurate, but back then, 99% of the global audience wouldn't know the difference between a 4G and a 428 just by seeing the popped hood. I mean, we would today, most of us, but back then, most of us were young. Next up is the infamous race, the 4-way race. I won't get into the multiple gear shifts and the fact that a quarter-mile race doesn't take 3 minutes. I will also not dwell on the fact that nobody paints lines on the street and does a 4-way drag race, not any place I've ever been. The way the scene was originally written was the Eclipse's gauges up on the A-pillar popping off, wires shorting out and creating smoke in the car. The riveted floorboard, apparently someone saw those diamond plate floor mats sold at Pep Boys and interpreted them as being actual floorboards attached to the car. But my main argument was about the danger of the manifold build. My suggestion had to do with the nitrous tanks being overpressurized and pop in the safety valve. And let me explain what I mean. Nitrous bottles, if you've ever run a nitrous system, a lot of people like to run a bottle heater. It's like a little piece of material that goes around the bottle with heating elements on it. And you want to heat the bottle up so that you get full pressure, about 900 psi, give or take, as I recall. You want to keep the bottom in its optimal pressure range. So the fact that they were going to mention fried rings and the thing was going to be smoking at the end of the scene wasn't going to work because they still had to drive, rescue Dom and then get away from the cops. So we needed something that wasn't terminal, something that wasn't going to blow the engine or anything. So I came up with the idea of having the gauges just be green, yellow, and red. Any idiot, even knows nothing about cars, if you see the gauge sweep into a red zone, you know something's wrong. Anybody would realize that. So maybe there was a malfunction in the bottle heater, tanks overpressurized, they popped a safety valve, and now ice cold nitrous is coming out of the bottles and fogging up the interior and filling it up with haze and smoke. When nitrous comes out, you can see just like it comes out of the purge valve, it's basically a smoke screen, right? It comes out of the bottle at minus 125 degrees Celsius, which means the windows would fog up and all that kind of stuff. That would be perfect because then Brian could be distracted by that and that would factor into him losing the race, and the car would still be drivable at the end of that scene. Director Rob Cohen compared what I had submitted to what was in the script, and he said basically, no one will know the difference. Car people are not going to be watching this movie. Okay, man, your movie, your money. But we were left to ask ourselves the question, how does a car with fried piston rings drive off but run from the cops a few minutes later? Laughably, when rescuing Toretto, though, the missing floor pan was obviously ignored by most audiences. They didn't realize that the floor pan had fallen out of the car. So what is Dominic Toretto doing, hanging out with his feet like Fred Flintstone style? It doesn't matter, of course, because the car is destroyed a few moments later when Brian somehow gets so lost in Hawthorne that he ends up Westminster, a full county, and a full 35 miles away. And this is when we come to the infamous nitrous explosion scene. I'm going to try to be brief here. Nitrous is not explosive. It's also not flammable, but it supports combustion when under pressure because it's an oxidizer. You can do the research on that. I'm not going to get into that. In short, shooting at a car with nitrous tanks in the back will not cause it to explode. The next scene shows Brian arriving at Toretto's garage. This is where he shows off a wrecked Supra, and upon popping the hood, we see a non-turbo Supra. That's like going to a strip club and all the dancers are stuffing their bras. Sure, it's a 2JZ, but it's not the 2JZ GTE. The T, of course, stands for turbo. And if you ain't got the T version, you ain't have any Tokyo tornadoes under your hood. It could have been worse, of course. The script originally had Jesse saying, "Oh my God, a Skyline motor." That would have broken the internet back in 2001. There would be open conflict between RB fanboys and 2JZ lovers.
3. Human sacrifice, dogs and cats living together, mass hysteria.
Anarchy. Seconds later, we see the crew picking up a truckload of car parts. It took a lot of people about 20 years to figure out that the white bumper on the back of the truck was for a Miata. And I remember seeing this movie in the theater thinking to myself, oh shit, that's not even a Supra bumper. Somebody's going to call us out. Never saw it called out until this past year. So either people got smarter or people just ignored it for 20 years. And now the next scene is Brian and the crew working on the Supra. At one point, the camera pans down and we see some miscellaneous car parts. What's funny is most of that was shit out of my garage. A lot of them were from my old Mustang, like the camshafts. Some are some generic parts that you would never use on a Supra. And funnier still that there were duplicate parts like intake plenums and such. Fast forward a bit more and we're at the backyard barbecue scene. And this is the only scene where they used the suggested dialogue that I wrote exactly as I wrote it.
Dear Heavenly
Spirit.
Spirit, thank you. Thank you for providing us with the direct port nitrous injection, 4-core intercoolers, and ball bearing turbos, and titanium valve springs.
The story about that was pretty simple. The night before shooting, Rob called me and asked me to write some kind of car-based prayer, and I emailed it to him a few minutes later. And then I made a note of my script just to so that I remember what I said, because I kind of came up with it quickly, just to compare it to the notes later on. The next scene that's interesting is the Racer's Edge scene when Hector comes into the shop. This is the part where he's buying parts. Hector comes in and buys 3 Spoon engines, which of course are for Hondas, along with a bunch of other parts, and this raises Brian's suspicion. Shortly thereafter, Brian finds himself staring down the barrel of a shotgun, going over the parts list that Hector just purchased in front of Dominic Toretto. For some reason, Paul mentioned something called a Motec system exhaust. I have no idea where he got that from. The first time I saw that in a movie theater was at a test screening, and I cringed. Either Paul forgot the line, or he ad-libbed it and got confused, or someone rewrote it, but by the time I saw the edited rough cut, it was too late to reshoot the scene, so it had to stay in there. And Rob said there's nothing we can do about it now. Now this brings us to race wars. There are a few things worth mentioning here. One, Johnny Tran's S2000 didn't have $100,000 under the hood. In fact, he didn't have $100,000 total in the whole car. He didn't even have $3,000 under the hood. The actual Hero 1 car, owned and built by R.J. Devera, had an exhaust intake and some cosmetic mods, and that's it. 2, there's no way on God's green earth that anyone would take a 2-liter automatic transmission Volkswagen Jetta and run it against an S2000. Now, of course, the producers led you to believe that maybe the Jetta was faster. Maybe it was a VR6 or a built turbo motor, or maybe we were just assuming both of those things, but really it was a grosser getter. Lastly, I've covered this about 1,000 times, but once more, the Jetta did indeed have front calipers. What you see in all those memes is the stunt car, not the actual Hero 1 car. The Hero 1 Jetta had giant racing brakes, and we weren't going to spend $5,000 on brakes for a stunt car. So we used fake discs when we lined up the stunt car for the drag race. Fake discs have been around for 50 years. It's nothing new. And of course, after Race Wars, we have one big scene, the movie's climax, which is now the infamous final drag race. Lots to talk about here. The first thing is the fact that a Supra on street tires would have no chance to run with a 900 horsepower Charger on drag slicks. Not going to happen. The second thing is that a car on drag slicks doesn't do a wheelie while smoking the tires at low speed. If the car hooks up enough to lift the front end of the car off the ground, then the tires aren't smoking. There may be a little bit as they start to transition to traction and take off. And while it's possible in some cases, it happens during that transition phase between grip and slip. So we did that, of course, with wheelie bars that were hidden digitally. And lastly, if a car hits the front end of a semi, it doesn't ride up the side of the semi and flip over the top of it. It would have hit it right at the wheel level. crushed the whole front right side of the car, spun around to the left, and that would be the end of that. Despite all this, the first movie has become a cult classic, and the cheesy movie quotes and social media memes will probably outlive me. I'll see you next time.